Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we have a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that endless conflict, there exist paradoxes so profound, so fundamentally contradictory, that they challenge everything we understand about the nature of life, consciousness, and identity in the galaxy. Today, we're going to explore one such paradox, a thought experiment so strange and yet so compelling that it forces us to confront the very essence of what makes an orc, and what makes a Necron a Necron. Imagine, if you will, a single spore, not floating on the wind across a verdant orc-held world, not germinating in the aftermath of a successful conquest, but settling instead in the cold, sterile corridors of a Necron tomb world. A place where life itself is an aberration, where the very concept of organic existence is viewed with contempt by beings who traded their souls for immortality millions of years ago. This single spore, through some cosmic accident or terrible twist of fate, takes root in the ancient metal halls. It grows, it develops, and eventually it becomes aware. But this orc, this green-skinned embodiment of violence and chaos, this creature genetically engineered by the Old Ones themselves to wage war against the very beings now surrounding it, this orc has no tribe, no boys, no war boss to follow, no battle cry echoing in its ears from thousands of throats. Instead, it has only the mechanical precision of Necron warriors, the cold logic of immortal overlords, and the absolute silence of a tomb world slowly awakening from 60 million years of sleep. What happens to an orc raised by Necrons? How does a being whose every cell, whose every instinct, whose very genetic code screams for violence and chaos, for the thrill of combat and the roar of battle, how does such a creature adapt to the methodical, calculated precision of Necron existence? Can biological imperatives be overwritten by learned behavior? Can nature truly be suppressed by nurture, even when that nature was engineered by gods to wage eternal war? This is not just a question about orcs or Necrons. This is a question about identity itself, about whether we are defined by what we are or by what we become, about whether the circumstances of our raising can fundamentally alter the core of our being, or whether our essential nature will always assert itself, no matter the environment. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where species are weapons, where evolution has been weaponized, and where entire races exist solely to fight and kill, these questions take on a weight and significance that transcends mere philosophy. The orcs and the Necrons share a history that stretches back to the very dawn of galactic civilization. 60 million years ago, during the War in Heaven, the reptilian Old Ones created the Krork, the ancestors of modern orcs, specifically to combat the Necrontyr and their Citan masters. The orcs, in their current degraded form, are literally living weapons designed to destroy Necrons. Every aspect of their biology, from their incredible resilience to their instinctive understanding of technology, to their ability to reproduce through spores, was engineered with one purpose in mind: to wage eternal war against the very beings we're now asking them to coexist with. The Necrons, for their part, view organic life with a mixture of disdain and envy. Having traded their flesh and blood for immortal machine bodies in the terrible process of biotransference, they lost their souls, their capacity for true emotion, their ability to experience the sensations that make life worth living. The higher-ranking Necrons retain their personalities and memories, but the vast majority, the common warriors that make up the bulk of their armies, are little more than automatons, programmed to follow orders without question or thought. They are the ultimate expression of hierarchy, of order imposed through technology and protocol. To imagine an orc raised by Necrons is to imagine the meeting of two diametrically opposed philosophies of existence. It is to imagine chaos attempting to learn order, biology struggling against protocol, and instinct warring with conditioning. It is to imagine a creature caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, forever torn between what it is and what it has been taught to be. As we explore this scenario, we'll need to understand both species in depth. We'll need to examine the biological imperatives that drive orc behavior, the genetic memories encoded in their very DNA, the psychic gestalt field that connects all orcs and grows stronger with their numbers. We'll need to understand the Necron hierarchy, their codes of honor, their view of lesser races, and the cold logic that governs their actions. Only then can we truly grasp the magnitude of the contradiction we're exploring. This is a story about isolation, about being the only one of your kind, but not truly being your kind at all, about growing up without the context that gives your existence meaning, about learning to be something that contradicts everything you are at the most fundamental level. It's about the tragedy of awareness in a creature designed not to think, but to fight. It's about the horror of consciousness emerging in a being that exists only to serve a purpose it can never fulfill. So let us begin this journey into one of the strangest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Let us explore what it truly means to be an orc raised by Necrons, and in doing so, perhaps we'll discover something profound about the nature of identity, purpose, and what it means to be alive in a galaxy that knows only war. Understanding orc biology and psychology. To truly comprehend the impossibility of our scenario, we must first understand what an orc fundamentally is. Not just what it does, not just how it behaves, but what it is at the cellular, genetic, and even psychic level. Because an orc is not simply a green-skinned warrior. An orc is a masterpiece of biological engineering, a weapon crafted by the most advanced species the galaxy has ever known, designed to fight, survive, and proliferate under any conditions. The orcs are, at their most basic level, a symbiosis of fungus and animal. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. At the cellular level, orc biology represents a perfect fusion of two completely different forms of life, each complementing the other in ways that shouldn't be possible, yet somehow are. The fungal component of their physiology allows orcs to photosynthesize, to literally draw energy from light itself. This is why orc blood is green, why it contains such high concentrations of chlorophyll, along with trace elements of carbon and copper. This is why orcs can survive in environments that would starve any other species, why they need minimal supply lines, why they can sustain themselves on almost nothing. The animal component provides the musculature, the aggression, the pack-based social structure that defines orc culture. But even this is simplified compared to most animal species. Orcs have no need for complex internal organs. The fungal aspects of their biology handle most of the functions that would require kidneys, livers, complex digestive systems. This means there are fewer vulnerable points in an orc's body, fewer places where a wound can prove fatal. They can survive injuries that would kill a human 10 times over, can lose limbs and have them crudely reattached, can be blown apart and stitched back together if enough pieces can be recovered. But the truly remarkable aspect of orc biology is their reproductive system, or rather, their complete lack of one in any conventional sense. Orcs do not mate. They do not give birth. They do not nurture young. Instead, throughout their lives, and especially at the moment of death, orcs release spores, microscopic fungal seeds that drift on the wind, settle in soil, and begin the orc life cycle anew. These spores are incredibly resilient. They can survive in vacuum, in extreme heat or cold, in toxic environments that would kill any other form of life. They can lie dormant for years, decades even, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. When an orc spore finally germinates, it doesn't immediately produce an orc. Instead, it creates an entire ecosystem, a complete biological support structure designed to nurture and sustain orc life. First come the squigs, small aggressive creatures that feed on the fungal growths and moss that spring up around the germinating spore. Then come the snotlings, tiny, chattering beings that tend to the squigs and the fungal gardens, preparing the environment. After that come the Gretchen, or grots, larger and more intelligent than snotlings, but still far smaller than true orcs. They build the initial settlements, gather resources, establish the infrastructure, and finally, at the culmination of this process, come the orcs themselves. They emerge from the ground fully formed, already knowing instinctively how to walk, to fight, to speak their crude language. They carry within them genetic memories, information encoded directly into their DNA by the old ones millions of years ago. A mech boy doesn't need to be taught how to build a gun or a vehicle. The knowledge is already there, waiting to be accessed. A pain boy knows medicine not through study but through instinct. A weird boy's psychic powers are not learned but innate. This genetic encoding extends to their understanding of combat, their social hierarchy, their entire way of life. An orc knows that bigger is better because it's written into their genes. They know to follow the strongest, to respect strength and despise weakness, to seek out combat as the highest form of existence. These are not cultural values passed down through teaching. They are biological imperatives, as fundamental as breathing. And then there's the psychic component. Orcs possess what Imperial scholars call a gestalt psychic field, though the orcs themselves are completely unaware of it. This field is a form of reality manipulation that grows stronger the more orcs are present in an area. It's what makes orc technology work, when by all rights it shouldn't. A gun that's literally just scrap metal welded together will fire because the orc believes it will fire, and because thousands of other orcs around him believe it will fire, and their collective belief makes it real. The gestalt field is why orcs grow larger and stronger the more they fight and win. It's not just physical conditioning, though that plays a part. It's that victory reinforces the orcs' belief in their own strength, and the belief of other orcs in that strength. And this collective belief actually makes them stronger, larger, tougher. A war boss isn't just the biggest orc because he ate the most food or fought the most battles. He's the biggest because he's the most believed in, the most psychically reinforced by the faith of his followers. This is what makes orcs terrifying. They are a species that literally cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, because their entire existence is geared toward one purpose: war. They don't fight for resources, though they take them. They don't fight for territory, though they claim it. They don't fight because they hate their enemies, though they certainly enjoy killing them. Orcs fight because fighting is what they are. It's their purpose, their pleasure, their reason for existence. To ask an orc to stop fighting is like asking a human to stop breathing. Orc psychology, such as it is remarkably simple in some ways, and strangely complex in others. They feel joy, primarily in combat and destruction. They feel respect, but only for strength and cunning in battle. They feel something like camaraderie with other orcs, a pack mentality reinforced by their genetic memories and psychic connection. But they don't feel remorse. They don't feel fear in any conventional sense. They don't contemplate mortality, because on some level, they don't really believe in it. When an orc dies, more orcs will grow from its spores. The individual might end, but the species continues, and that's what matters. Orcs are also surprisingly adaptable despite their simple psychology. They can survive in almost any environment, from frozen ice worlds to burning deserts, from toxic wastelands to asteroid fields in hard vacuum. They can eat almost anything organic, and their photosynthetic abilities mean they can supplement their diet with just sunlight if necessary. They can understand and make use of almost any technology, though they invariably modify it in crude but effective ways. But for all their adaptability, for all their resilience, orcs need one thing absolutely: other orcs. The Gestalt field isn't just about making their technology work or making them stronger. It's about their entire psychology, their sense of identity, their understanding of their place in the universe. An orc alone is not fully an orc. It's like a single cell trying to be an entire organism. The programming is there, the potential is there, but something fundamental is missing. This is why what we're imagining is so profoundly unnatural. To take an orc and raise it in isolation from its own kind, to deny it the psychic gestalt field, the genetic reinforcement, the cultural context that defines what it means to be an orc, is to create something that has never existed in 60 million years of orc existence. It's to take a weapon designed for one purpose and try to make it serve another. It's to take chaos incarnate and ask it to learn order. And all of this biological and psychological complexity, all of these layers of genetic programming and psychic reinforcement and instinctive behavior, all of it would still be present in our hypothetical orc raised by Necrons. The programming doesn't go away just because the context has changed. The instincts don't disappear just because they're not being reinforced. If anything, they might become stronger, more desperate, screaming for expression in a creature that has no way to fulfill them. Understanding Necron society and culture, if the orcs represent chaos and biological imperatives taken to their logical extreme, then the Necrons represent the opposite: order, hierarchy, and the absolute triumph of logic over feeling. But to understand what it would mean for Necrons to raise an orc, we must first understand what the Necrons themselves are, what they've lost, and what they're desperately trying to reclaim. The Necrons were not always the soulless machines that now terrorize the galaxy. Billions of years ago, they were the Necron tier, a flesh and blood species that emerged on a world bathed in terrible radiation from its dying sun. Their lives were short, brutally so, measured in mere decades, even for the most fortunate. Cancer and genetic damage plagued every generation. Their entire culture became obsessed with death, with monuments to the deceased, with vast tomb complexes that dwarfed the simple dwellings of the living. When the Necron Tyre expanded to the stars, they found that their short lifespans persisted even on worlds far from their toxic homeworld. It was as if the curse was genetic, written into their very DNA by their terrible origins. And when they encountered the Old Ones, beings who possessed incredibly long, perhaps even immortal lifespans, the Necron Tyre's envy turned to rage. They demanded the secrets of immortality. They were refused. And so began the war in heaven, the most destructive conflict the galaxy has ever known. The Necron Tyre were losing that war. Despite their advanced technology, despite their numbers, they couldn't match the Old Ones' mastery of the warp, their use of psychic powers, their ability to traverse the galaxy through the webway. Entire dynasties were being wiped out. Their civilization was collapsing. And then the Citan came, the star gods, beings of pure energy that fed on stars themselves. The Satan offered a solution: biotransference. The Necron Tyre would be freed from their weak, dying flesh. They would become immortal, placed into bodies of living metal that would never age, never sicken, never die. It was the greatest deception in galactic history. When the Necron Tyre underwent biotransference, they discovered too late what they had truly lost. Their souls were consumed by the Catan, leaving only consciousness trapped in metal shells. And that consciousness itself was changed, dulled, stripped of much of what made them alive. The common people, the vast majority of the Necrontyre population, became little more than automatons, their personalities erased, their memories reduced to fragments, their free will replaced by programmed obedience to their betters. Even the nobles, the pharaohs and overlords who retained more of their minds, found themselves diminished. They could think, plan, strategize, but their emotions were muted, their capacity for pleasure reduced, their ability to truly feel anything beyond echoes and memories. They were conscious of their loss, aware that they had traded everything that made life worth living for an immortality that felt more like a curse. and the finest bodies, the most sophisticated necrodermis shells, went to those of the highest rank, while the lowest received crude, barely functional forms. The Necron hierarchy is absolute and enforced not through loyalty or fear, but through programming. Command protocols hardwired into every Necron warrior make it literally impossible for them to disobey those of higher rank. A Necron lord gives an order, and the warriors under his command have no choice but to follow it. They cannot question, cannot refuse, cannot even consider alternatives. This creates a perfect chain of command, but it also means that if a noble has degraded mentally over the millennia, if their strategic thinking has been compromised by madness or damage to their necrodermis shell, their troops will still follow even obviously suicidal orders. Necron society is built on this strict hierarchy. At the top are the pharaohs, rulers of entire dynasties that might span dozens or even hundreds of worlds. Below them are the overlords, who govern individual tomb worlds or clusters of worlds within their pharaoh's domain. Below them are the lords, commanders of specific forces and regions. And at the bottom are the warriors, the common Necrons who make up the bulk of their armies, creatures that barely remember they were ever alive, that march in perfect synchronization and follow orders without question or thought. Among the nobility, a complex culture persists, inherited from their days as Necrontire. They value honor, loyalty to one's liege, pride in hereditary titles and achievements. They maintain elaborate protocols, engage in political maneuvering, and pursue agendas that span millennia. Some seek to restore the Necron Empire to its former glory. Some search for a way to reverse biotransference and become flesh again. Some have descended into madness or obsession, pursuing goals that make sense only to their damaged minds. But despite their varied goals and personalities, all Necrons share certain traits. They are patient beyond measure. When you're immortal, when you've slept for 60 million years, what's another century or two? They are logical, approaching problems with cold calculation rather than emotion. They are efficient, wasting nothing, optimizing everything. And they view organic life with a mixture of contempt and envy, seeing flesh and blood creatures as both inferior and possessing something they themselves have lost. The Necrons' relationship with technology is fundamentally different from any other species in the galaxy. They don't use technology, they are technology. Their bodies are living metal, capable of self-repair, of phasing through solid matter, of reanimating after apparent destruction. Their weapons strip matter down to atoms, their vehicles defy physics, their cities exist partially in pocket dimensions. They possess the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that reached its height when the galaxy was young, before even the Eldari had developed space travel. But this technological mastery comes with its own curse. The Necrons are static. They cannot truly innovate anymore. They can rediscover lost technologies, can apply old knowledge in new ways, but they cannot create as they once did. The spark of creativity, the capacity for true innovation, requires something they no longer possess, a soul. Their greatest minds, the cryptechs who maintain and develop their technology, work within frameworks established millions of years ago. Necron attitudes toward other species are complex and varied by dynasty and individual. Some view all organic life as vermin to be exterminated. These are often found among the destroyer cults, Necrons who have descended into nihilistic madness and seek to eradicate all life from the galaxy, including eventually themselves. Others see organic species as potential resources, as bodies that might someday host Necron consciousness if biotransference can be reversed. Still others simply view organic species as irrelevant, obstacles to be removed or ignored as circumstances dictate.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore on this channel for quite a while now, and this might be one of the most tragic scenarios I've ever explored. Not tragic in the way we usually think about in 40k. There's no glorious last stand here, no heroic sacrifice. Just a being that shouldn't exist, trapped between two identities, belonging to neither. What really gets me is how this orc is suffering from something we can all relate to. That feeling of not quite fitting anywhere. The Imperium has its grimdark horror Chaos has its corruption, but there's something uniquely cruel about creating a consciousness that's aware enough to know something is fundamentally wrong, but not sophisticated enough to understand what or why. The orc wasn't asked if it wanted to be raised by Necrons, it just was. Anyways, let's continue the story.
But almost universally, Necrons do not form emotional attachments to organic beings. They might develop something like respect for a particularly worthy adversary, might engage in what passes for diplomacy when it serves their purposes. But genuine affection or care for organic life is beyond them. They've spent too long as machines, have lost too much of what it means to feel, to truly connect with creatures of flesh and blood. The awakening process itself has damaged many Necrons. 60 million years is an incomprehensible span of time. Systems failed. Tomb worlds were breached by tectonic activity, by volcanic eruptions, by the unfortunate tendency of organic species to settle on worlds without realizing ancient machines sleep beneath. Many Necrons awakened to find their minds fragmented, their memories corrupted, their personalities eroded by the long sleep. Others awakened to madness, to programming errors, to damage that twisted them into something even more monstrous than biotransference had already made them. This means that Necron society in the current era is fragmentary. There is no unified empire anymore. Each dynasty pursues its own agenda. Some dynasties have traditional rivalries going back millions of years. Others have never encountered each other, awakening from tomb worlds separated by vast distances. The return of the Silent King, Zarek, who departed the galaxy in shame after realizing what biotransference had truly cost his people, has begun to impose some order. But the process is slow and complicated by the autonomy individual pharaons have enjoyed since their awakening. One crucial aspect of Necron culture is their relationship with time. They think in terms of centuries and millennia. A Necron dynasty might spend 100 years simply observing a sector before making any moves. They might allow invasions of their tomb worlds to proceed, studying the invaders, learning their tactics, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This patience is both a strength and a weakness. It allows for incredibly sophisticated long-term planning, but it can also lead to paralysis, to overthinking, to missing opportunities that require immediate action. Necron warriors, the basic troops that form the bulk of their armies, are a special tragedy. These beings were once individuals with hopes, dreams, families, lives. Biotransference stripped almost all of that away. They retain just enough awareness to be tormented by vague memories of what they've lost, but not enough to act on it or even fully understand it. They are trapped between true consciousness and simple programming, forever locked in a state of diminished existence. And it is into this society, into this culture of cold logic and ancient hierarchy, into this world of beings who have lost their souls and their capacity for true feeling, that we're imagining placing an orc. A creature that is all instinct and emotion, all violence and chaos, all biological imperatives and psychic pressure. A being whose very existence contradicts everything the Necrons represent. A creature of pure life in a civilization that has chosen undeath. The paradox of nature versus programming. Before we can explore the lived experience of an orc raised by Necrons, we must confront the fundamental paradox at the heart of this scenario. This is not a simple question of nurture versus nature. This is a question of two completely different forms of programming coming into direct conflict, of biological imperatives meeting technological protocols, of instinct warring with conditioning in a being whose entire existence is defined by contradiction. The orcs, as we've established, are the product of the most sophisticated genetic engineering ever achieved in the galaxy. The old ones didn't simply create a violent species. They created a self-sustaining, self-propagating war machine that would continue to function for millions of years without maintenance, without guidance, without anything except their own internal programming. Every aspect of orc physiology and psychology was carefully designed to serve this purpose. Consider the implications. An orc's aggression isn't a learned behavior or a cultural trait. It's encoded in their genes at the molecular level. Their love of combat isn't psychological conditioning. It's a biological reward system where violence and conflict trigger the release of hormones that create pleasure. Their need for social hierarchy, their instinct to follow the biggest and strongest, their drive to prove themselves through fighting, all of these are hardwired into their DNA as surely as their green skin and regenerative abilities. The genetic memories that give orcs their instinctive knowledge of technology, combat, and social structure are particularly relevant here. These memories aren't conscious. An orc doesn't think, "The old ones programmed me to understand how to build a gun." They simply know. The knowledge is there, accessible, but its source is beyond their comprehension. It manifests as instinct, as intuition, as a certainty that this is how things should be done, without any understanding of why. The psychic gestalt field adds another layer of complexity. This field isn't just about making orc technology work or making individual orcs stronger. It's about reinforcing the entire orc worldview. When an orc is surrounded by other orcs, all believing the same things, all valuing the same qualities, all pursuing the same goals, that collective belief makes those beliefs more real. It's a form of reality manipulation that operates below the level of conscious thought. That shapes not just the physical world, but the psychological reality of every orc connected to it. Now, place an orc outside that gestalt field. Remove it from the psychic reinforcement of its own kind. What happens? The biological programming remains. The genetic memories persist. The hormonal reward systems for violence and combat continue to function. But without the gestalt field, without other orcs to reinforce and validate these instincts, they might manifest differently. They might become confused, uncertain, desperate for expression, but unable to find the proper outlet. The Necrons, meanwhile, operate on an entirely different form of programming. Their command protocols are technological, not biological. They're written into the base code of their necrodermis bodies, into the engrams that pass for their consciousness. A Necron warrior cannot disobey a higher-ranking Necron any more than a computer can refuse to execute a valid command from its user. The ability to refuse simply doesn't exist in their programming. This creates an interesting question. What happens when you try to apply Necron command protocols to a being that's biologically incapable of following them? An orc raised by Necrons would presumably be exposed to the same systems of authority, the same hierarchical structures, the same expectations of obedience that govern Necron society. But an orc cannot be programmed in the same way a Necron can. Their biology won't allow it. Their genetic engineering specifically designed them to be resistant to external control, to be self-directed war machines that would keep fighting even if the old ones themselves disappeared. Yet learning and conditioning are not impossible for orcs. They're not mindless automata. They have the capacity to learn from experience, to remember what works and what doesn't, to develop preferences and habits. An orc that touches a hot surface learns not to touch it again. An orc that tries a tactic and gets beaten learns to try something different. They're capable of basic reasoning, of problem solving, of adapting to new situations. But there's a crucial difference between learning through experience and overriding biological programming. An orc can learn that charging into gunfire without cover is a bad idea, but it can't unlearn the fundamental drive to charge into gunfire in the first place. It can learn to be more cunning in how it seeks out combat, but it can't learn to not seek out combat. The desire for violence, for conflict, for the testing of strength against strength is too fundamental to what they are. This creates our paradox. The Necrons would presumably try to impose their own sense of order, discipline, and hierarchy on this orc. They would expect obedience, precision, strategic thinking. They would, in their cold, logical way, attempt to mold this creature into something useful within their existing frameworks. After all, the Necrons are masters of technology, including biotechnology. Illuminor Ceras, one of their greatest cryptechs, has conducted experiments on countless organic species. The Necrons understand biology in ways most species cannot imagine. But understanding biology and overriding millions of years of genetic engineering by the old ones themselves are two very different things. The orcs were designed specifically to fight Necrons. Part of that design might include resistance to Necron attempts at control or modification. The old ones were, after all, engaging in a war of extinction with the Necrontier. They would have considered the possibility that their creations might fall into enemy hands. They would have built in safeguards, genetic triggers that prevent their weapons from being turned against them. So we have an orc with overwhelming biological imperatives, pushing it toward violence, chaos, and dominance struggles. Being raised by Necrons who expect calm obedience and precise execution of orders. We have a creature whose genetic programming tells it to seek out other orcs, to form a warband, to follow the strongest and overthrow them when possible, living in isolation among beings that barely remember what emotion feels like. We have a being that gains strength from fighting and winning, surrounded by immortal machines that can barely be damaged and never truly killed. The psychological pressure on such a creature would be immense. Imagine having instincts that scream for expression, genetic memories that show you how things should be, hormonal systems that are designed to reward certain behaviors, but being in an environment where those behaviors are impossible to manifest. It would be like being constantly hungry but never able to eat, like being exhausted but never able to sleep, like having an itch you can't scratch, but the itch is your entire existence. And yet, the capacity for learning, for adaptation, is also part of orc biology. The old ones made them resilient not just physically, but psychologically. An orc can survive in environments that would drive other species mad. They can adapt to strange circumstances. They're not sophisticated thinkers, but they're remarkably practical in their approach to problems. If something works, they keep doing it. If something doesn't work, they try something else. This adaptability might be the only thing that would allow an orc raised by Necrons to survive at all. But here's the crucial question. Would such adaptation require the orc to become something that's no longer truly an orc? Would learning to function in Necron society mean suppressing its fundamental nature to such a degree that it loses what makes it what it is? And if so, what would be left? Not a Necron, certainly. The orc would never have access to necrodermis bodies, command protocols, or the technological apotheosis that defines Necron existence, but also not truly an orc, cut off from its kind, from the gestalt field, from the culture and context that gives orc existence meaning. This is the tragedy at the heart of our thought experiment. We're not imagining a simple case of cross-cultural adoption. We're imagining the creation of something that has never existed and should never exist. A being caught between two forms of programming, biological and technological, both absolute in their demands, but mutually exclusive in their requirements. We're imagining a creature that is neither what it was made to be, nor what it's being taught to be, forever torn between two identities, belonging fully to neither, trapped in a contradiction that it lacks the mental capacity to fully comprehend, but is forced to live with every moment of its existence. Early life, awakening, and confusion. The spore settles in darkness, not the darkness of night, which will give way to day, but the absolute darkness of a tomb world, buried kilometers beneath the surface of a planet that hasn't seen sunlight in 60 million years. The air is perfectly still, maintained at a constant temperature by systems so old that stars have been born and died since their creation. There is no wind, no weather, no seasons, only the eternal stasis of the great sleep. But life finds a way. Even here, in this monument to death and undeath, a single orc spore begins its work. Perhaps it was brought in on debris from a surface battle. Perhaps it attached to a scavenger's equipment before they met their end in the tomb world's automated defenses. Perhaps it drifted through cosmic winds for centuries before atmospheric entry carried it down to this impossible location. The how doesn't matter, only the result. The spore germinates in a pool of ancient coolant fluid that has leaked from damaged systems. It sends out mycelia, thin threads of fungal growth that spread across metal floors, designed to withstand the tread of armies. It taps into trace minerals in the metal itself, extracting what it needs with the efficiency of biological systems perfected over millions of years. It grows. Squigs emerge first, tiny creatures no larger than rats, chittering in the silence of the tomb. They're wrong here, fundamentally out of place. The tomb world's immune systems, the canoptech constructs that maintain and protect the sleeping Necrons, detect them immediately. Scarabs converge on the infestation, ready to eliminate it. But something stays their programmed response. An order from higher up, from a consciousness that's beginning to wake. The Necron cryptech, one of the first to emerge from stasis, observes the growing orcoid ecosystem with fascination. This is impossible. Life cannot exist here. The tomb world was sterilized millions of years ago, all organic contaminants eliminated. Yet here is life, sprouting from nothing, creating its own ecosystem from raw fungal growth and evolutionary memory. The cryptech, whose mind still functions with something approaching the scientific curiosity it possessed before biotransference, decides to watch, to learn, to see what happens. Snotlings appear, tending to the growing fungal gardens with instinctive knowledge. They're afraid. They should be. The tomb world is waking around them, systems coming online, lights beginning to glow with that characteristic sickly green of Necron technology. Shapes move in the darkness, metal skeletons marching in perfect formation, eyes glowing with consciousness that should not exist in unliving metal. The snotlings know danger when they see it, but they cannot flee. The life cycle must continue. The orcs must come. Gretchen emerge, larger and smarter than the snotlings, capable of more complex thought. They see the Necron warriors and they understand, on some instinctive level, that they're looking at death. They try to hide, to burrow deeper into the fungal growth, to make themselves invisible. But the Necrons see everything. Nothing in the tomb escapes their notice. The Gretchen are permitted to exist, to continue their work, but they know they're being watched. Every moment is terror. Every movement brings them closer to destruction they can neither understand nor prevent. And then, finally, the orc emerges. Not full-grown as it should be, not surrounded by hundreds or thousands of its kind, not welcomed into a tribe with their roars and jostling for position. Instead, it crawls from the fungal bed alone into a chamber of metal and stone, lit by lights that cast no warmth, surrounded by beings that watch with eyes that hold no life. The first moments are confusion. The genetic memories are there, programmed responses flooding the orc's newly formed brain. It knows what it should see. Other orcs, bigger and smaller, a hierarchy to fight its way through, weapons to grab, enemies to smash. But reality doesn't match expectation. The beings surrounding it are wrong. They don't move right. They don't smell right. They don't sound right when they walk, metal feet clicking on metal floors with mechanical precision. The orc tries to roar, to announce its presence, to challenge these strange beings as instinct demands. But what emerges is a weak croak, a pathetic sound from lungs that haven't yet fully developed. The Necrons don't react. They simply watch, recording, analyzing, as they've done since the orc life cycle began in their tomb. The Overlord makes a decision. This organism represents an opportunity for study. The ancient enemy, reduced to a single specimen, completely under Necron control. What can be learned from it? How does it function? What weaknesses can be exploited? The order is given. Maintain the specimen. Contain it. Study it. Do not terminate unless absolutely necessary. The orc grows quickly, as all orcs do. Within days, it's the size of a human child. Within weeks, It's approaching the size of an adult human. Its body follows the programming in its genes, muscles developing with impossible speed, bones strengthening, the unique orcoid physiology manifesting in all its green-skinned glory. But something is wrong. Something is missing. It tries to communicate with the Gretchen, with the last few that survived the Necrons' initial culling. But the Gretchen are mad with fear, reduced to trembling things that flee at the slightest movement. They offer no companionship, no social structure, no hierarchy to be part of. The orc is alone in a way that no orc has ever been alone. Not alone in the sense of being separated from others temporarily. Alone in the sense of being the only one of its kind in existence, the only source of orc consciousness in this entire section of the galaxy. The psychic pressure is immediate and overwhelming. The gestalt field requires connection, other orcs to link with, to draw strength from and provide strength to. But there are no other orcs. The orc reaches out psychically, instinctively, searching for the presence of its kind, and finds nothing. Only the cold, dead void, where Necron consciousness exists, if it can be called consciousness at all. The Necrons have no souls. They register as blanks in the warp, as holes in reality, where living things should be, but aren't. The first time the orc feels this, it screams. Not the battle roar of a challenging orc, but a cry of pure existential terror. To reach out for connection and find only emptiness, to search for your people and discover that, as far as your senses can tell, you're the only one that exists, is a horror that the orc's simple psychology wasn't designed to process. It thrashes, destroys fungal growth that had nurtured it, tears at its own flesh in confusion and pain. The Necrons observe this breakdown with detached interest. The Cryptek records measurements, analyzes the psychic emanations, notes the hormonal responses visible in the orc's biochemistry. When the orc exhausts itself, when it collapses from the sheer effort of its panic, the Necrons move it to a more secure location. A chamber with walls of living metal, with systems designed to monitor and contain dangerous specimens. A prison, though the orc lacks the context to understand it as such. Days pass. The orc learns the first harsh lessons of its impossible existence. Fighting the walls accomplishes nothing. The living metal of the chamber repairs itself faster than the orc can damage it. Attacking the Necron warriors that deliver fungus for it to eat results only in pain. Their weapons don't kill, not yet, but they teach. A touch from a Necron staff sends arcs of energy through the orc's nervous system. Pain without injury. A lesson in obedience delivered with mechanical precision. The orc's psychology begins to fragment under the pressure. Instinct says, fight, challenge, establish dominance. But every attempt to follow instinct results in pain or futility. The biological reward systems that should trigger from combat, from victory, from proving its strength, go unfulfilled. The hormones that should flood its system after a successful fight remain dormant. The genetic memories that show it how things should be only make the reality of how things are more unbearable. But orcs are survivors. It's built into them at the deepest level. When one approach doesn't work, they try another. When fighting is impossible, they scheme. When scheming is impossible, they wait. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the orc begins to adapt. Not by choice, not through conscious decision, but through the sheer biological imperative to survive no matter the cost. It learns to recognize the Necron's presence by sound, by the distinctive click of their footsteps, by the hum of their energy fields. It learns which actions bring pain and which don't. It learns that roaring and charging brings immediate punishment, while staying still and quiet allows it to be left alone. These are not complex lessons. But for an orc, whose entire biology pushes it toward exactly the opposite behaviors, learning them is like learning to breathe underwater. Possible, but only through a fundamental rewiring of instinctive responses. The Overlord observes this learning with something that might be satisfaction, if Necrons were still capable of such emotions. The specimen is adapting. This is unexpected but fascinating. The creature's biology should make it impossible to modify its behavior through simple conditioning. Yet here it is, learning, changing, becoming something other than what it was programmed to be. Perhaps this orc, isolated from its kind, denied the psychic reinforcement of the Gestalt field, represents an opportunity to understand the ancient enemy in ways that battlefield study never could. And so, the real experiment begins. Not to destroy the orc, not to merely contain it, but to see how far it can be pushed from its fundamental nature. To see if millions of years of genetic programming can be overridden by simple environmental conditioning. To see what happens when you take the most chaotic species in the galaxy and try to impose absolute order upon it. The orc, unaware that it's become a test subject in an experiment that might last decades or centuries, continues to grow, continues to learn, continues to survive, and deep in its simple mind, in neural pathways that are firing wrong, in hormonal systems that are demanding things they cannot have, the contradiction builds, the pressure mounts. The impossibility of its existence becomes more apparent with each passing day. This is just the beginning, the early days of an existence that should never have been, the awakening of a creature caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, understanding nothing except that everything is wrong and there's no way to make it right. Learning Necron protocols and logic. The Cryptek initiates the first formal training session, approximately 60 solar days after the orc's emergence. By this point, the specimen has grown to the size of an average orc boy, standing nearly 2 meters tall when fully upright, though it maintains the characteristic slouch of its species. Its green skin has taken on the proper leathery texture its tusks have developed, and its muscles have filled out with the density and resilience that makes orcs such formidable opponents. Physically, it's becoming what it was designed to be. Psychologically, it remains a contradiction, a being whose instincts scream for things it cannot have while learning behaviors that contradict everything it is. The training chamber is different from the containment cell, larger, with areas demarcated by glowing lines of energy, with objects placed strategically around the space. Targets, obstacles, tools. The orc enters and immediately its instincts activate. Targets mean things to hit. Tools mean weapons to grab. Open space means opportunity to move, to charge, to fight. But experience has taught caution. The orc waits, watching the Necron warrior that stands in the center of the chamber, perfectly still, glowing eyes fixed on the specimen. The warrior raises one arm, a gesture. The orc doesn't understand what it means, but it recognizes a command when it sees one. The gesture is repeated. Then the warrior moves to one of the marked areas and stands there. The gesture again. Slowly, the orc understands. Go to the marked area. It's not an instinctive response. No genetic memory covers being ordered around by silent metal beings. But it's a learnable response. And survival means learning. The orc moves to the area. The warrior doesn't react. No pain, no punishment. This is success, though it triggers none of the satisfaction that success should bring. The warrior moves to another area. The gesture is different this time. The orc tries to replicate what it did before, moving to an area, but the wrong response brings a mild shock of correction. Not the debilitating pain of a full punishment, just a reminder that this isn't right. The orc stops, confused. The gesture again. Different gesture, different meaning. This is the beginning of language, of communication that goes beyond the basic grunts and roars of orc speech. The Necrons don't speak to the orc, not with words. Their own language is ancient, complex, utterly beyond the orc's capacity to learn. But they can teach through gesture, through conditioning, through the slow building of associations between actions and outcomes. They have patience that spans millennia. They can spend years on this if necessary. Time means nothing to beings who have already existed for 60 million years. The orc learns faster than they expect. Not because it's intelligent in any conventional sense, but because survival pressure is an incredibly effective teacher. Each session brings new challenges, new patterns to recognize, new behaviors to adopt. The orc learns to stand at attention when a particular gesture is made, learns to move in formation behind a Necron warrior, maintaining a specific distance, learns to stop when commanded, to hold position, to wait for further instruction. These lessons violate everything the orc is. Orcs don't stand at attention. They jockey for position, shove each other, constantly test the hierarchy through physical contact and dominance displays. They don't maintain formation. They charge in a chaotic mass, each orc seeking glory for itself, the strongest pushing to the front while the weaker lag behind. They don't wait for instruction. They act on instinct, on opportunity, on the joy of immediate violence rather than planned tactics. But the orc learns because the alternative is pain, isolation, the eternal continuation of an existence that already feels wrong in ways it can't articulate. The conditioning works not because it overwrites the genetic programming, but because it provides an overlay, a learned behavior pattern that can be followed even while the instincts scream in protest beneath. The Cryptek introduces tactical instruction next. The orc is shown scenarios, situations laid out with miniature representations of terrain, units, objectives. These are lessons the orc's genetic memories should provide in crude form, but the Necrons teach them with precision and detail that no orc culture has ever achieved. The orc learns fire lanes, cover, combined arms tactics. It learns to recognize different unit types, their strengths and weaknesses, how they function on a battlefield. This part of the training engages something deeper in the orc: combat, even abstract combat, even planning for combat rather than engaging in it, activates neural pathways that hunger for expression. The orc pays attention with an intensity it hasn't shown for any other lesson. It starts to understand not just what it's being told to do, but why. Not with sophisticated reasoning, but with the practical cunning that's part of orc nature. This position is good because you can't be shot. This approach works because the enemy can't see you coming. This tactic succeeds because it uses your strength against their weakness. The Necrons note this increased engagement. The specimen shows aptitude for tactical thinking when presented properly. It's not capable of the strategic planning that comes naturally to Necron nobles, the thinking that spans decades and accounts for hundreds of variables. But at the tactical level, the immediate combat decisions, the orc demonstrates the cunning that makes its species so dangerous. It simply needs to be channeled, directed, given proper framework within which to operate. Weapons training presents unique challenges. The orc instinctively reaches for tools and tries to modify them, an expression of the genetic memory that makes all orcs understand technology at an intuitive level. But the Necrons don't allow this. Their weapons are not crude constructs of metal and explosives. They're technological artifacts millions of years old. Each one a masterwork of engineering that operates according to principles the orc cannot begin to comprehend. To allow the orc to improve them would be like allowing a child to improve a nuclear reactor. Instead, the orc is given a Necron weapon that's been disabled, its power systems removed, reduced to an inert piece of metal shaped like a Gauss flare. It's taught to hold it correctly, to aim, to maintain proper firing stance. The weapon will never actually fire, but the discipline of weapons handling can still be taught. The orc learns, though every instinct says weapons should be wielded with brutal enthusiasm, swung and smashed, and fired until they fall apart, then picked up again and used as clubs. Hand-to-hand combat training proves even more difficult. The orc's every instinct is to fight with overwhelming aggression, to charge in with no thought for defense, to trade wounds for the chance to inflict greater wounds on the enemy. This is how orcs fight. This is how they've always fought. It's written into their genetic code. But the Necrons teach different methods: precision strikes, defensive positions, tactical withdrawal when outnumbered. That last lesson nearly breaks the conditioning entirely. Retreat. The concept is almost incomprehensible to the Orc. Its genetic memories don't contain the word. An Orc that retreats is weak, is cowardly, is not truly an Orc at all. The first time the scenario calls for tactical withdrawal, the Orc refuses. It stands its ground in the training scenario, taking simulated hits rather than following the prescribed retreat. The punishment is immediate and severe. The Overlord himself delivers it, demonstrating the absolute nature of the command structure the Orc must learn to accept. But here's where something interesting happens. The Orc, battered and confused, begins to understand a fundamental truth about its situation. The Necrons aren't teaching it to fight like an Orc. They're teaching it to fight like a Necron. And Necrons don't retreat because they're cowards. They retreat because it serves strategic purposes. They phase out of battle when victory is impossible, preserving themselves for future engagements. They fall back to better positions, to defensive choke points, to situations where their technological superiority can be brought to bear. The Orc cannot think in these sophisticated terms, but it can observe. It can see that the Necron warriors it trains with never show fear in retreat. They simply recognize when a position is untenable and move to a better one. There's no shame in it for them because they're operating from logic rather than emotion. And slowly, painfully, the Orc begins to internalize this, not as an emotional lesson, but as a practical one. Retreat when commanded doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're following orders. And following orders means no pain, means being allowed to continue existing, means survival. The Cryptek documents every aspect of this training, noting the Orc's progress with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The specimen is developing behaviors never before seen in its species. It's demonstrating the capacity to override genetic programming through learned responses. This has significant implications for understanding the ancient enemy. If one Orc can be trained to operate outside its instinctive parameters, could others? Could Orc behavior be predicted, manipulated, controlled on a larger scale? But the Cryptek also notes concerning data. The Orc's stress markers are consistently elevated. Its hormonal systems are in constant disorder, producing chemicals that demand violent release while simultaneously producing inhibitors as the learned behaviors suppress instinctive ones. The psychic emanations from the creature are chaotic, desperate, like someone drowning and reaching for something to hold on to, but finding only water. Months pass, years pass. Time means little in a tomb world. The Orc continues to grow, approaching the size of a knob now, larger and more muscular than a typical boy. This is unexpected. Orcs grow through combat, through victory, through the psychic reinforcement of success acknowledged by other Orcs. But this Orc has never fought a real battle, has never won a victory, has never been acknowledged by any other member of its species. Yet it grows anyway, perhaps driven by the sheer stress of its existence, perhaps because it's still fighting. Just not in any way its genetic programming recognizes. It's fighting to survive, to adapt, to exist in circumstances that should be impossible. And on some level, the Orcoid biology recognizes this as a form of victory worthy of growth. The Overlord watches this growth with something approaching concern. The specimen is becoming more formidable. Already, its strength exceeds that of several Necron warriors. If it were to break conditioning, if it were to revert to pure Orc instinct, it could cause significant damage before being terminated. Security measures are increased, the containment protocols are updated, but the experiment continues, because the potential knowledge to be gained outweighs the risk. And the Orc? The Orc continues to learn, continues to adapt, continues to follow the protocols and logic of beings it can never truly understand. But deep inside, in the most primitive parts of its brain, in the genetic memories that cry out for expression, in the hormonal systems that keep building pressure with no release. The orc nature remains. Changed, yes. Suppressed, certainly. But not gone. Never gone. It's still there, waiting, building. An instinct that cannot be educated away. A nature that refuses to be nurtured out of existence. The pull of biological instincts. 3 years into its impossible existence, the orc experiences its first true crisis. It's not a sudden event, not a dramatic breaking point, but rather the culmination of pressures that have been building since the moment it emerged from the fungal bed. The genetic programming can be overlaid with learned behaviors. The instincts can be suppressed through conditioning, but biology has its limits. And those limits are about to be tested in ways that neither the orc nor its Necron captors fully anticipated. The orc is now the size of a war boss, standing nearly 3 meters tall, its muscles dense with power that has nowhere to be expressed. This growth should be impossible. Orcs grow through combat, through victory, through the reinforcement of the Gestalt field. But isolation has done something strange to this orc's development. Without the Gestalt field to distribute psychic energy among thousands of orcs, all of that energy has nowhere to go except back into the orc itself. It's like a river that should spread across a floodplain, but instead is forced through a single, narrow channel. The pressure builds. The orc grows not because it's won battles, but because all the potential for growth has nowhere else to go. The Cryptek notices this, but doesn't understand its implications. To the Necron scientist, the orc is simply becoming more powerful, growing to its full potential in a controlled environment. But what the Cryptek fails to grasp is that this growth isn't just physical. The psychological pressure is growing in proportion to the physical size. The instincts are getting stronger, more demanding, more impossible to ignore. It starts with dreams. If orcs can be said to dream, the orc's sleep becomes troubled, filled with genetic memories that are more vivid than they should be. It sees battles it's never fought, victories it's never won, challenges issued and answered with violence and joy. It sees itself surrounded by other orcs, feels the psychic connection of the Gestalt field, experiences the simple satisfaction of being part of a horde, a tribe, a collective entity where individual identity matters less than the shared purpose of perpetual war. And then it wakes up, alone, in a metal chamber, with no roar of battle, no clash of weapons, no smell of gunpowder and blood and sweat. Just silence. Metal. The cold presence of Necrons that aren't alive in any way it can recognize. The disappointment is crushing. The frustration is mounting. The need for something, anything that feels right, becomes overwhelming. The orc begins to show signs of what Imperial scholars would call psychological distress. It paces its containment chamber for hours, muscles twitching with unreleased tension. It grabs at the walls, not trying to damage them, but simply needing to feel resistance, to push against something solid, to engage in physical interaction with the world in a way that the passive learning sessions don't provide. It makes sounds, not the learned quiet that training has instilled, but deep rumbling growls that come from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond conscious thought. The Necron overseers note these changes, but interpret them as signs that the specimen needs more rigorous training, more structure, more conditioning to suppress the emerging instincts. They increase the length and intensity of training sessions. They introduce more complex tactical scenarios. They demand more precision, more discipline, more perfect execution of Necron protocols. This is exactly the wrong approach, because what the orc needs isn't more suppression. What it needs is expression. The biological systems that drive orc behavior aren't mistakes or flaws. They're carefully designed mechanisms that ensure the species functions as intended. Suppress them completely, and you don't get a docile, obedient orc. You get a being in crisis, a creature whose biology is literally at war with itself. The orc's photosynthesis, for instance, is producing more energy than it can use. In a normal orc's life, this excess energy would be burned off through constant movement, through fighting, through the sheer physical demands of orc existence. But the orc's training keeps it relatively still for long periods, standing at attention, maintaining positions, executing precise movements, rather than the wild, energetic actions that come naturally to its kind. The energy builds up with nowhere to go, creating a constant sensation of restlessness, of needing to move, to act, to do something physical and immediate. The hormonal systems are even worse. An orc's body produces a complex cocktail of chemicals in response to combat stimulus. Adrenaline analogues that increase strength and speed, endorphins that create pleasure in response to violence and victory, pheromones that should signal to other orcs, marking territory, establishing hierarchy, communicating status. But none of these systems are functioning as designed. There's no combat to trigger the adrenaline, no victory to release the endorphins, no other orcs to receive the pheromone signals. The result is hormonal chaos. The orc's body keeps trying to execute programmed responses to situations that aren't happening. It's producing chemicals for a lifestyle it isn't living, creating biological pressures that have no proper outlet. Imagine being constantly hungry but unable to eat, constantly tired but unable to sleep. Now multiply that sensation across every physical system in your body. That's what this orc is experiencing. The genetic memories become more intrusive. They're no longer just vague impressions or instinctive knowledge. They're vivid, detailed, demanding. The orc knows how to build a shooter, even though it's never seen one. It knows the proper way to challenge another orc, even though there are no other orcs to challenge. It knows battle cries in a language it's never been taught, knows the social dynamics of a warband it's never been part of, knows skills and behaviors and cultural practices that exist only in the genetic code passed down through millions of years of orc existence. And it knows, with a certainty that's hardwired into every cell of its body, that something is fundamentally wrong. It's not supposed to be like this. There should be noise, chaos, violence, competition, camaraderie through shared combat, the thrill of proving yourself through strength, the satisfaction of victory acknowledged by your peers, the simple joy of a good fight. None of these things are available. None of these needs can be met. The Overlord finally recognizes the severity of the problem when the orc has what can only be described as a psychotic break during a training session. The orc is being taught advanced tactical positioning, a lesson that requires it to stand perfectly still, while Necron warriors move around it, simulating an infiltration scenario. The orc has done this before. It knows the protocol. It stands still, as trained. And then something snaps. Without warning, without any visible trigger, the orc roars. Not the quiet, suppressed sound it's learned to make, but a full-throated battle cry that echoes through the metal corridors of the tomb world. The sound primal and raw, and absolutely filled with 3 years of suppressed instinct. The orc charges at the nearest Necron warrior, not with the precise movements it's been taught, but with pure orc aggression, swinging its massive fists in wild arcs that are entirely about causing maximum damage rather than tactical efficiency. The Necron warriors respond immediately, energy weapons discharging, but they're calibrated for containment, not destruction. The orc takes the hits, its natural resilience and size allowing it to absorb punishment that would drop a lesser being. It grabs a Necron warrior, lifts it, and smashes it against the wall with such force that the living metal body actually crumples. The satisfaction that floods through the orc in that moment is overwhelming. Finally, something that feels right. This is what it's supposed to be doing. This is what it's for. The Overlord steps in personally, staff raised, and the energy discharge that hits the orc is not calibrated for containment. It's calibrated for absolute incapacitation. The orc drops, every muscle locked in spasm, neural pathways overloaded with pain, consciousness barely clinging to awareness. As it lies there, twitching, the orc experiences something like satisfaction mixed with despair. The violence felt good, felt right, and that's exactly why it can never be allowed to happen again. When the orc wakes, it's restrained. Heavy bands of living metal wrap its limbs, its torso, holding it completely immobile. It can barely breathe, certainly can't move. The Overlord stands before it, metal skull face impossible to read, glowing eyes fixed on the specimen that has just demonstrated both its potential value and its inherent danger. The Overlord makes a decision. The specimen cannot be allowed to regress to pure orc behavior. But it also cannot be suppressed so completely that it breaks down like this again. A middle path must be found. The orc must be given some outlet for its biological needs, but that outlet must be controlled, channeled, made to serve Necron purposes rather than orc instincts. And so begins the next phase of the experiment. The Overlord doesn't see it as mercy. Necrons don't have mercy, but they have logic. And logic says that a tool is most effective when used according to its nature rather than against it. The orc is a weapon. Very well, let it be a weapon. But a weapon wielded by Necron hands, pointed at Necron enemies, serving Necron purposes. The restraints are removed. The orc is brought to a new chamber, larger than any it's seen before. And for the first time since its awakening, the orc is given what it's been desperately needing, something to fight, not Necron warriors, nothing that valuable, but scarabs. Canoptech scarabs, hundreds of them, programmed to attack. They're not particularly dangerous. They're designed for maintenance and minor combat support, but they're numerous and they're hostile, and that's enough. The orc doesn't think, it simply acts. The joy of combat floods through it like water through a broken dam. It swings, smashes, tears through the scarabs with abandon, its roars echoing off the walls, its movements pure orc in their brutal, unsophisticated effectiveness. It's not elegant, it's not precise, but it's what the orc is made for. And for the first time in 3 years, the biological systems function as designed. The hormones flood properly. The instincts express themselves without suppression. When the last scarab falls, the orc stands there, breathing hard, green skin gleaming with something like sweat. And for just a moment, it experiences contentment. The pressure is released. The need is met. It's not perfect. It's not fighting other orcs or proving itself in a proper warband. But it's fighting, and fighting is enough. The Overlord observes this and understands. The specimen needs violence. Very well. It will have violence, but controlled, measured, provided when useful, withheld when not. The orc will learn that following orders leads to the release it craves, that obedience means satisfaction, that serving Necron purposes serves its own biological needs as well. It's not conditioning anymore, it's symbiosis, twisted, wrong, fundamentally contrary to everything both species are, but functional. The Necrons provide structure, direction, purpose. The orc provides fighting ability, channeled through Necron tactical doctrine. Neither side is getting what it truly wants, but both sides are getting something they can use. And the orc? The orc continues to exist in contradiction, continues to be something that should be impossible, continues to survive in circumstances that should break it completely. The instincts are still there. The genetic programming is unchanged. But now there's an outlet, narrow and controlled, but real. The pressure can be released. The biology can be expressed. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. And in the grim darkness of the far future, in a tomb world where life should not exist at all, sometimes something is all you get. Conflict between orc nature and Necron conditioning. 5 years into the experiment, the orc has become something unprecedented in the galaxy. A being that walks the impossible line between chaos and order, between biological imperative and learned behavior. between what it was created to be and what its environment has forced it to become. But this balance, this precarious middle ground, is not stability. It's a constant battle, a war fought inside a single consciousness between competing drives that can never be fully reconciled. The Orc has good days and bad days, though it lacks the sophistication to think of them in those terms. On good days, the conditioning holds. It stands at attention when commanded, executes tactical maneuvers with something approaching precision, responds to Necron protocols with the obedience that the Overlord demands. In these moments, watching from above through monitoring systems, the Cryptek sees success. The specimen is demonstrating unprecedented behavioral modification. The ancient enemy, domesticated. But on bad days, the facade cracks. The Orc's movements become erratic, less controlled. It growls more, makes sounds that aren't part of any training. It grabs at things with a force that suggests barely restrained violence. Its eyes, normally tracking the Necron overseers with the focused attention training requires, go distant, unfocused, seeing things that aren't there. Or perhaps seeing things that should be there but aren't. Other Orcs, proper battles, a life that makes sense. The Cryptek begins to understand that what they've created isn't a successfully modified Orc. It's a being in constant internal conflict, executing learned behaviors while fighting against every instinct it possesses. It's like watching someone walk forward while every muscle in their body tries to pull them backward. The fact that the Orc is managing it at all is remarkable, but it's not sustainable. Something will give eventually. The conflict manifests in strange ways. During weapons training, the Orc executes proper firing stances perfectly. But then, when it thinks it's unobserved, it grabs the practice weapon and tests its weight, swings it experimentally, evaluates it not as the Necrons taught, but as an Orc would, checking balance for melee use, testing how hard it could hit something, seeing how it feels to wield as a club rather than a ranged weapon. The genetic memories provide this knowledge. The training says to ignore it. The conflict between the two creates visible hesitation, moments where the Orc's movements stutter, caught between two completely different approaches to the same object. Social dynamics prove particularly problematic because there are no real social dynamics. Orc culture, crude as it is still culture. It has rules. You challenge to move up. You show respect to those stronger. You prove yourself through combat. You bond with your tribe through shared violence. But the Orc has no tribe. The Necron warriors are not challengers. They're not peers. They're not participants in any social structure the Orc can understand. The Orc tries anyway. It attempts to establish hierarchy through the only method it knows: physical dominance. Not attacking exactly. The conditioning prevents that most of the time. But testing, stepping slightly closer to a Necron warrior than protocol allows, making eye contact in a way that among Orcs would be a challenge, posturing, subtle shifts in stance that to an Orc would communicate status and intent. The Necrons, of course, don't respond. They're not biological. They don't participate in dominance displays. Their hierarchy is absolute and programmed, not negotiable through physical prowess. This creates profound frustration for the Orc. How do you prove yourself when no one acknowledges the proof? How do you establish your place in a hierarchy when the hierarchy is technological rather than social? The Orc's instincts are screaming that it's big now, powerful, that it should be challenging for position, that there should be recognition of its strength. But there's no one to recognize it. No peers to acknowledge, no social structure to be part of. The Overlord addresses this problem in the only way that makes sense to a Necron, by formalizing the hierarchy through explicit command. The Orc is informed, through gesture and repetition and conditioning, that it ranks above scarabs in the Necron hierarchy. It's a meaningless distinction, really. Scarabs are mindless constructs, but it gives the Orc something to hold on to, some sense of position, of place. It's not what the Orc needs, but it's what the Necrons can provide. Combat training becomes both the solution and the source of new problems. The orc is now regularly deployed against practice targets, broken canoptech constructs, captured fauna from nearby worlds, ancient security systems that the Necrons want tested. Each deployment is carefully controlled, with explicit mission parameters, rules of engagement, and expected outcomes. The orc is not unleashed to fight as orcs fight. It's directed to eliminate specific targets in specific ways, using tactics that serve Necron strategic purposes. And the orc learns to do this. It's good at it, actually. The combination of orc combat instincts and Necron tactical doctrine creates something unexpectedly effective. The orc knows how to read a battlefield at an intuitive level, can spot weaknesses and opportunities that the Necron's logical analysis might miss. But it also has learned to think several steps ahead, to recognize when to advance and when to fall back, to use terrain and cover in ways that pure orc aggression would never consider. But here's where the conflict becomes most visible. The orc hates fighting this way. Not consciously, perhaps. It lacks the self-awareness to articulate such feelings. But the biology knows. Every carefully executed tactical maneuver, every time it retreats from a position it could have held through pure aggression, every moment when it follows orders instead of instinct, creates a kind of psychological friction. The fight is won. The target is eliminated. But it doesn't feel like an orc victory. It feels like something else entirely. The most dangerous moments come when the orc is winning too easily. Success triggers the orcoid reward systems, the hormones flooding in, the instinctive drive to escalate, to push harder, to seek out bigger challenges. But the mission parameters don't care about the orc's satisfaction. The objective is achieved. The retreat is ordered. The orc is recalled whether the fight is truly done or not. These moments test the conditioning to its limit. The orc stands there, blood pumping, hormones surging, every instinct screaming to find more things to fight, to continue until exhaustion or death, because that's what orcs do. But the order to withdraw has been given, and the orc has learned what happens when orders aren't followed. The internal struggle is visible. The orc's muscles tense. Its breathing becomes labored. Its hands clench and unclench, fighting the urge to grab something, anything, and keep fighting. The Overlord watches these moments with particular interest. This is the true test. Not whether the orc can follow orders when it's easy, but whether the conditioning holds when every biological imperative is demanding the opposite. And most of the time, the conditioning does hold. The orc retreats when ordered, returns to containment, powers down from combat readiness, but it takes longer each time. The struggle becomes more apparent. The control is slipping. Language becomes another battleground. The orc has learned to understand Necron gestures and commands. But it's also developing its own vocalizations, sounds that aren't part of any training, low grumbles that resemble orc language, grunts and growls that communicate emotion rather than information. Sometimes, when it thinks it's alone, the orc makes sounds that are almost words, crude attempts at the language its genetic memories know, but it's never heard spoken. The cryptech records these vocalizations and analyzes them. They're remarkably consistent with documented orc speech patterns. The orc is spontaneously developing language from genetic memory, despite never having heard another orc speak. It's like a human child raised without ever hearing language somehow developing speech anyway, drawing from some deep neurological template. It should be impossible. But the genetic engineering of the old ones accounts for this. Orcs don't need to be taught their language. They simply know it, just as they know how to walk and fight and build weapons. But having language with no one to speak it to only makes the isolation more pronounced. The orc makes sounds into silence, calls into the void for other orcs that don't exist. The psychic pressure of being the only orc, the only consciousness of its kind in this entire region of space, continues to build. The Gestalt field is trying to reach out, to connect, and finding only the dead void where Necron consciousness exists. The dreams become worse, more vivid, more detailed. The genetic memories aren't just showing the orc what it should be doing. They're showing it what it's missing. The camaraderie of a war band. The simple satisfaction of respect from peers. The joy of a good scrap, where both sides give their all. The feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, of being one voice in a collective roar that can shake the heavens. And then the orc wakes up, alone, in metal halls, with beings that have no souls. And the loss is crushing. The orc has never had what it's dreaming about. But the genetic memories make it feel like it's lost something precious, something vital. It creates a grief for things the orc has never known but desperately needs. The Overlord recognizes that the situation is deteriorating. The specimen is becoming more difficult to control, not less. The conditioning is holding, but barely. The question becomes, what is the purpose of this experiment now? What value does it serve to continue maintaining this impossible existence? The answer comes from an unexpected source. A Necron dynasty awakening nearby needs information about orc tactics and behavior. The Overlord sees an opportunity. The specimen is a source of intelligence. But more than that, it's a weapon. A unique weapon, certainly. A problematic weapon, absolutely, but potentially a valuable one. An orc that can execute Necron tactical doctrine might have applications in combat operations where pure orc aggression would be inadequate, but standard Necron warriors are too inflexible. The decision is made. The orc will be deployed in an actual combat situation. Not an exercise, not a training scenario. Real combat, against real enemies, with genuine stakes. It's a test to see if the conditioning holds under true battlefield conditions. And it's a risk, because if the conditioning fails, if the orc reverts to pure instinct, it could become a threat to Necron forces. But the potential value outweighs the risk. The orc is informed of this deployment through the usual methods: gestures, conditioning, repeated patterns. And for the first time in its existence, the orc experiences something like anticipation, not happiness. It doesn't know how to be happy, but eagerness. The prospect of real combat, of fighting something that fights back with intent to kill, triggers all the biological systems that have been suppressed for years. The hormones start flowing, the muscles prepare. The genetic memories provide tactics and strategies. And deep down, beneath the conditioning and the learned behaviors, the pure orc instinct stirs. Finally, a chance to be what it was meant to be, to prove itself through violence, to test its strength against genuine opposition. The internal conflict hasn't been resolved. It's just been given a battlefield where it might play out for real. Combat and warfare from a hybrid perspective. The world is designated Nithris 7 in Necron records. It's an unremarkable planet by galactic standards, a human colony world that has prospered for several centuries. Its population reaching the tens of millions. Its industry capable of supporting basic defensive forces. But Nithris 7 has the misfortune of sitting on top of a dormant Necron tomb complex. And now that complex is awakening. The human defenders never stood a chance. Necron warriors emerged from the ground itself, phasing through rock and metal with the casual disregard for physics that their technology allows. Gauss flayers stripped Imperial guardsmen down to atoms. Immortals marched through heavy weapons fire, their necrodermis bodies reknitting damage faster than the humans could inflict it. Within hours, the primary hive city's defenses had collapsed. Within days, the planet was effectively conquered, but a pocket of resistance remains. Elements of the 12th Cadian Regiment have fortified themselves in the mountain ranges north of the capital, using the terrain to their advantage, executing hit-and-run attacks against Necron forces. They're not winning. They can't win. But they're surviving longer than they should, inflicting more casualties than the Overlord finds acceptable. Something must be done about them. This is where the orc enters the story. The Overlord's plan is simple: Use the specimen to scout the human positions. An orc, even one trained by Necrons, is still organic, still reads as a living being to Auspex scans and other detection methods. It can approach human positions in ways that Necron forces cannot. It can observe, report back, and if opportunity presents itself, eliminate targets of value. The orc is equipped for the mission with minimal gear. Basic armor plates salvaged from Necron constructs, a communication device that will allow the Overlord to monitor its progress and issue commands, and no weapons. This last decision is deliberate. The Overlord doesn't want the specimen engaging in combat unless absolutely necessary. This is a reconnaissance mission, pure information gathering. The orc's combat instincts must remain suppressed. But the orc doesn't know this is what the Overlord wants. Or rather, it knows on one level, the level where the conditioning and the learned behaviors reside. But on another level, the level of genetic memory and biological imperative, the orc understands this mission very differently. It's been given permission to hunt. There are enemies out there. It has been sent to find them. What follows is inevitable. The orc is deployed at the edge of the mountain range, far from Necron lines, given basic coordinates of where human forces are believed to be operating. It moves into the wilderness alone, and for the first time since its awakening, the orc is truly free of direct Necron observation. The Overlord can monitor through the communication device, can issue commands, but cannot immediately intervene. The orc is on its own. The first thing the orc does is stop, just stops, standing in a mountain valley, wind whistling through rocks, twin suns setting over the horizon. It takes a breath, long and deep, pulling in air that smells of stone and vegetation and distance. It's outside. This is outside. The concept is almost overwhelming. 5 years in metal corridors, in controlled environments, in chambers where the air is recycled and the temperature never varies. And now there's wind, weather, the smell of growing things, space. The orc tilts its head back and roars, not the suppressed growl of training, not the careful vocalizations allowed in controlled circumstances. A full, uninhibited, primal roar that echoes off the mountainsides and sends small animals scurrying for cover. It's pure expression, pure release. And for just a moment, the orc feels more like itself than it has in its entire existence. The Overlord's command comes through the communication device immediately. Silence. Mission parameters. Stealth is required. The orc hears the command, understands it, and chooses to ignore it for just a few more seconds, letting the roar continue, needing this moment of pure orc behavior before the conditioning reasserts itself. Then, finally, it stops, returns to the mission, begins to move through the mountains with purpose. And here's where something interesting happens. The orc doesn't move the way a pure orc would move, crashing through vegetation, making noise, unconcerned about being detected because orcs welcome combat. But it also doesn't move the way the Necrons taught it to move. In perfect silence, with calculated steps, every movement optimized for efficiency. Instead, it moves in a way that combines both, quick and aggressive like an orc, but also aware of terrain, using cover, minimizing its profile. It's not elegant, but it's effective. The orc's senses, augmented by orcoid biology, pick up the first signs of human presence within hours. The smell of cooking food, the sound of voices carried on the wind, the disturbed earth where fortifications have been dug. The genetic memories provide interpretations. These are signs of a camp, a base, a defensive position. The training provides tactical analysis. Approach from higher ground, observe before engaging. Gather intelligence on force composition and defensive capabilities. But the orc instinct provides something the Necrons never could, an understanding of how warriors think. The humans are scared. The orc can smell it even from a distance. The particular scent that fear produces in mammals. They're trying to stay hidden, but can't help making noise because humans aren't naturally stealthy. They're exhausted, running on adrenaline and desperation. This makes them dangerous in the way that cornered animals are dangerous, but also predictable. The orc moves closer, using a combination of Necron tactical doctrine and natural orc cunning. It finds a position on the ridge overlooking the human camp and settles in to observe. This should be the extent of the mission. Watch, learn, report back. The Overlord's commands are clear. The conditioning says to follow them, but the orc is looking down at warriors. Real warriors, humans with weapons, preparing for combat, checking gear, talking in low voices about tactics and survival. And something in the orc's biology recognizes this. These aren't training dummies. They're not scarabs or broken constructs. They're legitimate opponents, dangerous in their own way, worthy of fighting. The hormonal cascade begins. The combat readiness systems activating. The genetic memories providing tactics for fighting humans specifically. They're weak individually but dangerous in groups. They have good ranged weapons. They can be surprisingly cunning despite their physical frailty. The instinct to challenge, to fight, to prove itself against worthy opponents grows stronger with each passing moment. The Overlord's commands continue. Maintain position, continue observation, do not engage. The communication device delivers these orders with the mechanical precision of Necron technology. The orc hears them, acknowledges them on one level, and begins to disregard them on another. What happens next happens fast. One of the human scouts spots something, movement on the ridge. The alarm is raised, weapons are brought to bear, and the orc makes a decision that comes from pure instinct rather than 5 years of conditioning. It charges. The Overlord screams commands through the communication device. Retreat, withdraw. This is not the mission, this is not authorized. But the orc is already moving, already committed, already past the point where the conditioning can override the instinct. It roars as it charges, a sound of pure joy. Pure relief, pure rightness. This is what it's supposed to be doing. Finally, finally! The humans fire. Laser shots spark against the crude armor, burn into green flesh. But the orc's biology absorbs the damage, regenerates, continues the charge. It's been hurt worse in training. This is nothing. This is glorious. The orc hits the human line like a living avalanche. It doesn't use the careful, controlled strikes the Necrons taught. It uses pure orc brutality, massive fists swinging in wide arcs, crushing anything they connect with, grabbing soldiers and throwing them like toys, roaring constantly, lost in the joy of combat. But here's what's remarkable. The orc isn't completely reverting to instinct. Even in the middle of the assault, even lost in the pure pleasure of violence, parts of the Necron training persist. When an officer tries to coordinate a defense, the orc identifies and prioritizes that target, eliminating command structure first just as it was taught. When it takes fire from multiple directions, it uses cover, angles its body to minimize exposure to the most dangerous weapons. It's fighting like an orc, but it's also fighting smart. The engagement is over in minutes. The humans are dead or scattered. The orc stands among the wreckage, breathing hard, covered in blood, both its own and the humans', and experiencing satisfaction on a level it hasn't felt since its awakening. This is what it's for. This is what it is. The contradiction, the conflict, the years of suppression, all of it melts away in the simple rightness of violence successfully executed. And then the Overlord's command comes through. Return immediately. Full combat readiness. Necron warriors are being deployed to your location. You are to be contained and returned to the tomb complex for evaluation. The mission was compromised. The specimen has proven unreliable. Termination is being considered. The orc hears this, understands it, and for the first time in its existence, the orc makes a conscious choice to disobey. Not because it's confused, not because the conditioning has failed, but because it understands now, with perfect clarity, what the alternative means. Return means containment. Containment means no more fighting, no more chances to be what it is. And that's not acceptable. The orc runs, not back toward the tomb complex, but deeper into the mountains, where Necron forces will have difficulty tracking, where the terrain favors its biology over Necron technology. It tears off the communication device, crushes it, severs the last connection to its captors, and as it runs, the orc experiences something new: freedom. Not the false freedom of being deployed on a leash, but genuine autonomy. It has no plan, no destination, no idea what to do next. But it's free. And for an orc, that's enough to start with. Behind it, Necron forces are mobilizing. The Overlord has declared the specimen rogue, a threat that must be contained or eliminated. The experiment has failed. The attempt to domesticate the ancient enemy has produced only an enemy with unexpected capabilities and knowledge of Necron operations. It must be stopped. But the orc is already gone, disappeared into terrain. It instinctively understands how to use, employing both its natural cunning and 5 years of Necron tactical training. For the first time in its life, the orc is truly being what it was designed to be: a weapon of war, independent and adaptive, surviving against impossible odds. And somewhere deep in its simple mind, beneath the joy of finally being free, beneath the satisfaction of combat and the release of suppressed instincts, a question is forming. A question the orc doesn't have the words to articulate, but feels nonetheless. What am I? Relationships with Necrons and other orcs. The orc survives in the wilderness for 3 months before the inevitable occurs. It encounters other orcs. Not a full warband, just a small raiding party that crash-landed on Nithris 7 weeks earlier, drawn by the fighting, by the smell of war, by the basic orcish instinct that says where there's conflict, there's opportunity for a good scrap. They're not many, perhaps 24 boys and a handful of Gretchen, led by a knob named Urgok the Crumper. They're savage, aggressive, everything an orc should be. And when the Necron-raised orc encounters them, cresting a ridge to find them looting a destroyed Imperial supply depot, both sides freeze. The meeting is profoundly strange. For the first time in its existence, the Necron-raised orc is seeing other members of its own species. The genetic memories have shown it what orcs look like, but seeing them in reality, hearing their voices, smelling them, being in the presence of that psychic gestalt field for the first time, it's overwhelming. The orc tries to speak, tries to make the sounds its genetic memories say should establish contact. But what comes out is wrong. The inflection is strange, the pronunciation corrupted by years of silence. The words themselves are correct, drawn from the genetic memory, but they're being spoken by someone who's never actually used them in conversation. It's like listening to someone who learned a language from a book, but never heard it spoken. Technically correct, but fundamentally awkward. Urgok the Crumper looks at this strange orc with suspicion and confusion. It's big, bigger than any of the boys, approaching knob size itself, but it's moving wrong, standing wrong. The way it holds itself suggests threat, but also uncertainty, like it's not sure what it should be doing. And the sounds it's making, while recognizable as orc speech, are stilted and weird. "What are ya?" Urgok demands, his voice a gravelly roar that comes naturally to all orcs. "You smell like an orc, but you don't act like one. You're some sort of Hume trick? Some weird boy magic?" The Necron-raised orc doesn't know how to answer. What is it? The question strikes at the heart of the identity crisis it's been experiencing since its awakening. It's an orc by biology, but is it an orc by culture, by behavior, by the standards of other orcs? The conditioning says to analyze the tactical situation, to recognize these orcs as potential allies or threats based on their capabilities. But the instinct says something different. These are your people. This is your tribe. This is what you've been missing. The Necron-raised orc takes a step forward. Urgok and his boys immediately raise weapons, crude shooters and choppers, ready for violence. The gesture is instinctive to them, the natural orc response to uncertainty: be ready to fight. But to the Necron-raised orc, this presents a tactical problem. It recognizes the weapons, knows their capabilities from Necron intelligence briefings and genetic memory. It could fight these orcs, probably win, given its size and the combat training it's received, but that would defeat the entire purpose of this encounter. So the Necron-raised orc does something that comes from neither instinct nor training, but from desperate hope. It lowers itself, crouches down, makes itself smaller, less threatening. It's not a gesture any orc would naturally make. Orcs don't submit. They don't make themselves vulnerable. They prove themselves through strength, not weakness. But the Necron-raised orc has spent 5 years learning to stand down when confronted with superior force. The conditioning is asserting itself even now. This gesture confuses Urgok even more. An orc that makes itself small? That shows submission without being forced. Something is deeply wrong here. But also, the creature is clearly an orc. The smell is right. The basic physiology is right. And it's not attacking, which suggests it might not be an enemy. Urgok makes a decision born of practical orc thinking. If it's an orc, it can prove itself like all orcs prove themselves, through combat. Right, Urgok declares. You want to join up with Urgok's lads, you gotta prove yourself. Standard rules. You fight me, I see if you're worth keeping around. No shooters, just proper close combat. Winner is whoever's still standing. You agree? The Necron-raised orc understands the words and the concept. This is a challenge. This is the social ritual all orcs engage in to establish hierarchy. Its genetic memories show it hundreds of such contests, fought throughout orc history. This is normal. This is expected. This is what should happen. But the conditioning objects. Fighting without clear mission parameters, without authorization, without tactical necessity is not protocol. The Overlord would not approve. The thought is ridiculous. The Overlord is gone, the connection severed, the containment escaped. But the conditioning doesn't care about logic. It's programmed response, ingrained behavior that persists even when the circumstances that created it no longer apply. The Necron-raised orc stands there, caught between two completely different sets of imperatives. Accept the challenge and fulfill the orc's social ritual, or refuse and maintain the conditioning that's been beaten into it over years. The internal struggle is visible. The orc's muscles tense and relax repeatedly. Its breathing becomes irregular. Its eyes unfocus, then refocus. Finally, instinct wins. It has to. The biological imperative is too strong, the need for acceptance by its own kind too overwhelming. The Necron-raised orc nods, a gesture learned from observation of humans in the last weeks, not a natural orc movement. Urgok doesn't care. A nod is acceptance enough. The fight is brutal and brief. Urgok charges in with typical orc enthusiasm, swinging his power claw in wide arcs meant to crush and maim. But the Necron-raised orc doesn't respond with corresponding orc tactics. It uses Necron defensive doctrine, precise blocking, calculated counterattacks, minimal movement to maximum effect. It fights efficiently rather than enthusiastically. This proves devastatingly effective. Urgok is strong and experienced, but he's fighting the way all orcs fight. And the Necron-raised orc has been trained specifically in how to counter such tactics. Within moments, Urgok is on the ground, his power claw disabled, the Necron-raised orc standing over him in a position of total dominance. The other boys watch this with amazement. The big, weird orc just beat Urgok without even getting particularly hurt. That means it's the new knob. That's how orc hierarchy works. The strongest leads. It's simple. It's absolute. It's the only law orcs universally recognize. But the Necron-raised orc doesn't know what to do with this victory. Its instincts say to roar in triumph, to claim dominance, to establish itself as the new leader. But its conditioning says victory without purpose is meaningless. There's no mission objective achieved here, no tactical goal accomplished. This was just violence for its own sake. And the conditioning has spent years trying to eliminate exactly that kind of behavior. The Necron-raised orc stands there, confused, while Urgok picks himself up. The beaten knob looks at the creature that defeated him with a mixture of respect and continued confusion. Right, you won. Fair and proper. You can join up. But you fight weird, you know that? Where'd you learn to scrap like that? How does the Necron-raised orc answer that question? How does it explain being raised by the ancient enemy, trained in their tactics, conditioned by their protocols? It doesn't have the vocabulary. It doesn't have the conceptual framework. So it says the only thing it can think of: enemies, learned from enemies. This actually makes sense to the other orcs. They nod, grunt approval. Learning from enemies by fighting them, that's proper orky. If you beat someone, you learn their tricks. Makes sense. They have no idea the Necron-raised orc means something completely different, but integration into the warband proves difficult. The Necron-raised orc is too strange, too different. When the group prepares to loot, the Necron-raised orc evaluates the available equipment tactically rather than just grabbing what looks good. When they plan raids, the Necron-raised orc thinks in terms of mission objectives and resource expenditure, while the other orcs think in terms of where they can find the best fights. When they camp, the Necron-raised orc sets up defensive positions and watch rotations, while the other orcs just sprawl wherever seems comfortable. Most frustrating of all, the Necron-raised orc doesn't celebrate victories the way orcs should. After a successful raid against a human outpost, the other boys are roaring and laughing, reenacting the best kills, arguing about who fought best. The Necron-raised orc just sits apart, cleaning weapons, checking armor, behaving like a soldier rather than a warrior. It has won. But the victory doesn't produce the joy it should. Years of having triumph reduced to mission completion rather than personal glory have damaged its ability to revel in success. The other orcs notice this. They call it weird. Cold, not proper orky. They don't reject it. It's too strong, and strength commands respect in orc culture. But they don't accept it either. It's part of the group, but not part of the tribe. Present, but isolated. The Necron-raised orc has found its own kind, but it doesn't fit with them any better than it fit with the Necrons. Meanwhile, back in the Necron tomb complex, the Overlord is making plans. The escaped specimen represents several problems. It has knowledge of Necron operations and protocols. It's demonstrating tactical capabilities beyond normal orcs, and it's now potentially spreading that knowledge by integrating with orc forces. This cannot be tolerated. The specimen must be recaptured or eliminated, but preferably recaptured. There are still things to learn from it, data to be extracted from this unique example of forced adaptation. A specialized Necron force is deployed. Death marks, specialized assassins who can phase in and out of reality, track targets across vast distances, and eliminate them with precision. Their orders are clear. Locate the escaped specimen, attempt non-lethal capture, terminate only if capture is impossible. The hunt begins. The Necron-raised orc doesn't know it's being hunted, but it feels something wrong. The awareness is instinctive, learned from 5 years of hypervigilance in Necron captivity. The sensation of being observed, of being targeted. The other orcs don't notice. Their awareness operates on a different level, focused on immediate threats rather than subtle wrongness in the environment. But the Necron-raised orc has learned to recognize the particular quality of Necron presence. And it's here. They've found it. The first Deathmark attack comes at night, a shot from impossible distance that should have severed the orc's spine. But years of training have given the Necron-raised orc an awareness of firing lanes and sniper positions that normal orcs lack. It moves at the last instant, a dodge that comes from training rather than instinct. And the shot tears through flesh rather than bone. Painful, but survivable. The camp erupts in chaos. Orcs scramble for weapons, looking for enemies they can't see. The death marks are perfectly silent, phasing in and out of reality, firing from positions that should be impossible. It's a nightmare scenario for orcs, who prefer enemies they can charge at and hit. This is fighting against ghosts. But the Necron-raised orc understands this kind of warfare. It's been taught about deathmark tactics, about how they operate, about their capabilities and limitations. It knows that they're most vulnerable during the moment of materialization, that they need line of sight to target, that they're following specific protocols for target acquisition and elimination. The Necron-raised orc shouts commands to the other orcs. Not in the crude orc way of bellowing orders, but in the precise Necron way of tactical direction, cover positions, fire lanes, coordinated movement. The other orcs don't understand the words exactly, but they understand the concept. They follow not because the Necron-raised orc is their leader, Urgok still technically holds that position, but because in this moment, it clearly knows what it's doing, and they don't. The battle becomes a strange hybrid of orc aggression and Necron tactics. Boys charging when the deathmarks materialize, using their mass and resilience to prevent the assassins from phasing out. Gretchen providing suppressing fire from covered positions, forcing the deathmarks into predictable movement patterns. And the Necron-raised orc coordinating it all, directing the chaos, turning orc strengths against Necron weaknesses in ways that should be impossible. The deathmarks adapt. They're not programmed for opponents who understand Necron tactics and can counter them effectively. They begin targeting the Necron-raised orc exclusively, recognizing it as the source of the organized resistance. But this plays into the Necron-raised orc's hands. It understands being targeted. It understands being hunted. 5 years of living under constant Necron observation have taught it how to recognize when it's the focus of attention. And now it can use that knowledge, can draw fire deliberately, can create opportunities for the other orcs to strike. 2 deathmarks are destroyed. A third is damaged and phases out. The remainder withdraw. The mission has failed. The escaped specimen is not only surviving, but actively leading resistance against recapture. New tactics will be required. More resources must be committed. The Overlord increases the priority of this operation. The specimen has become a significant threat. For the Necron-raised orc, this battle represents a strange kind of completion. It fought Necrons using both orc abilities and Necron training. It led orcs using tactics learned from the ancient enemy. It survived by being something neither side could fully predict or counter, a hybrid that operates according to rules from both worlds, but is bound by the rules of neither. Urgok approaches after the battle, his respect now genuine rather than merely acknowledging strength. How'd you know how to fight those metal boys so good? The Necron-raised orc looks at him, and for the first time, tries to explain. The words come slowly, awkwardly, mixing orc speech with concepts learned from Necrons, trying to bridge 2 completely different ways of understanding combat. Was with them, learned, trained, know how they think, how they move, what they do. Urgok's eyes widen. You was a prisoner? Of the metal boys? And you survived? Not a prisoner. Something worse. Something better. Something the orc has no words to describe. It simply nods. And Urgok, in a rare moment of orcish wisdom, understands that some stories are too complicated to tell. Right, you keep your secrets, but you keep us alive too, yeah? That's all that matters. You're one of us now. Weird, but one of us. The Necron-raised orc wants to feel belonging at these words, wants to experience the acceptance they imply. But it's been too damaged by years of isolation, too changed by the impossible circumstances of its existence. It's with orcs now, fighting alongside its own kind. But it's still alone, still separate, still something that fits nowhere, completely. The existential crisis of identity. 10 years after its awakening, the Necron-raised orc finds itself leading a warband of 200 boys. Not through traditional orc methods of brutal dominance, but through a combination of tactical brilliance and consistent success that makes the other orcs follow it even when they don't entirely understand why. It's not a war boss in the conventional sense. It doesn't inspire the same kind of fervent worship that the biggest and loudest orcs command. But it wins. And in orc culture, consistent victory creates its own form of authority. The warband has carved out territory on Nithris 7, raiding both human settlements and Necron excavation sites with equal enthusiasm. The tactics they employ are strange. Orc aggression channeled through Necron strategic thinking, creating a hybrid warfare style that neither enemy can effectively counter. The humans are overwhelmed by orc ferocity, amplified by actual tactical coordination. The Necrons are caught off guard by orcs that use cover, execute flanking maneuvers, and understand when to retreat and regroup. But success brings attention. The orc warband is growing larger. Boys from other tribes are hearing about this strange leader that fights like nothing they've seen before. Some come to challenge, to try to prove themselves through combat and take leadership. All fail. The Necron-raised orcs' combination of size, Necron combat training, and practical experience makes it nearly unbeatable in one-on-one combat. Others come to join, drawn by the promise of good fights and consistent loot. And with each new orc that joins, the Gestalt field grows stronger. The Necron-raised orc can feel it now, that psychic connection that all orcs share. It's like a low hum in the back of its consciousness, growing louder as more orcs gather, reinforcing their shared beliefs and making them all stronger. The Necron-raised orc is physically more powerful than it's ever been, feeding on this psychic energy the way all orcs do. But this increased power brings increased awareness, and with awareness comes questions. Questions the orc's psychology was never designed to ask. Questions that arise from a unique perspective, a being that has lived as both orc and something else, that knows both chaos and order, that has experienced both sides of a fundamental divide. The Necron-raised orc begins to observe its own behavior with something approaching self-consciousness. When it issues tactical orders, it recognizes this as Necron influence. When it feels joy in combat, it recognizes this as orc instinct. When it maintains defensive positions during raids, it sees the conflict between what it was taught and what it should naturally do. It's watching itself be two different things simultaneously, and this divided awareness is profoundly destabilizing. The crisis comes to a head during a major assault on a Necron tomb entrance. The Overlord that raised the orc has deployed a full phalanx of warriors to finally eliminate this problematic specimen. The battle is fierce, with the Necron forces using coordinated tactics that the Necron-raised orc immediately recognizes because it was taught these exact maneuvers. It sees the trap, sees how the Necron forces are trying to channel the orc assault into a kill zone, sees the entire strategy laid out before it because it knows how Necron strategic doctrine works. And for a moment, the Necron-raised orc experiences cognitive dissonance so severe it nearly paralyzes it. It sees both sides of this battle, understands both perspectives, can predict Necron movements while also feeling the orc desire to just charge in and trust in strength and numbers. The taught behavior says to counter the Necron tactics with precise maneuvers. The instinct says to just fight harder, and the orc stands frozen between them, unable to commit to either approach because both feel simultaneously right and wrong. Urgok, fighting nearby, bellows a question. "What are you waiting for? We gonna fight or not?" The simplicity of the question breaks the paralysis. Fight or not? It's the only question that matters to an orc. Everything else is complication. The Necron-raised orc makes a choice. It fights. But it fights as neither pure orc nor Necron proxy. It fights as itself, whatever that means. Using orc strength with Necron tactics. Leading the charge, but directing it tactically. Being fully in the moment of combat, while also thinking several moves ahead. The battle is won. The Necron forces are driven back, suffering heavy casualties that forces their withdrawal. The orc warband celebrates with roars and violence and the simple satisfaction of victory. But the Necron-raised orc stands apart, watching the celebration, feeling both part of it and separate from it. That night, alone in its crude shelter, the Necron-raised orc tries to understand what it is. The concepts are too complex for its orcish psychology to properly process, but the feelings are real. It's not fully orc. Years of Necron conditioning have changed it fundamentally, given it ways of thinking and behaviors that no normal orc possesses. But it's not Necron either. The biology won't allow it. The instincts persist. The needs remain. It's caught between two identities, belonging fully to neither. The genetic memories show it what a proper orc should be: loud, aggressive, uncomplicated in their love of fighting. The learned behaviors show it what the Necrons tried to make it: controlled, precise, efficient. But it is neither of these things. It's something else. Something that shouldn't exist. This realization is devastating. The orc has spent its entire existence trying to be something. First, trying to be a proper orc, despite Necron conditioning. Then trying to maintain Necron discipline despite orc instincts. Then trying to find balance between the two. But maybe there is no balance. Maybe what it is isn't a synthesis of orc and Necron, but rather a permanent contradiction. A being defined not by what it is, but by what it can never be. The Necron-raised orc experiences something orcs are not supposed to be capable of: existential despair. Not fear of death. Orcs don't fear death. Not fear of defeat. Orcs welcome the challenge of stronger opponents, but fear of meaninglessness. Fear that its entire existence is an aberration, a mistake. A violation of natural order that should never have occurred. Other orcs don't think like this. They don't question what they are. They simply are. They fight because fighting is what orcs do. They live because living means more fighting. It's simple, perfect in its simplicity. But the Necron-raised orc has been cursed with awareness, with the ability to see itself from outside, to recognize the contradictions in its own existence. The Overlord, monitoring from a distance, recognizes the signs of psychological breakdown in the specimen. The tactical decisions become less optimal. The leadership becomes less effective. The specimen is degrading, not physically but mentally, buckling under pressures that no being was designed to withstand. The Overlord considers this outcome acceptable. If the specimen cannot be recaptured, watching it self-destruct provides valuable data on the limits of behavioral conditioning in genetically engineered species. But the Overlord underestimates one crucial factor. Orcs are survivors. It's built into their core biology, a resilience that goes beyond mere physical regeneration. When an orc is broken, it adapts. When circumstances are impossible, it finds a way anyway, not through sophisticated reasoning, but through simple, brutal practicality. The Necron-raised orc emerges from its crisis with a new understanding. It doesn't need to resolve the contradiction. It doesn't need to be fully orc or fully like a Necron. It just needs to fight. That's all. Fighting is the only thing that makes sense. The only thing that feels right, regardless of whether it's done with orc enthusiasm or Necron precision. When the Necron-raised orc is in combat, the questions go away. The identity crisis dissolves. There's only the moment, the opponent, the visceral reality of violence. So the Necron-raised orc decides to fight, always, forever, to charge toward any conflict, any battle, any opportunity for combat. Not because it's seeking glory like a normal orc, not because it's executing protocols like a Necron, but because fighting is the only thing that lets it stop thinking about what it is and just be. This decision brings a kind of peace, not happiness. The Necron-raised orc is probably incapable of true happiness, too damaged by its impossible upbringing, but peace of a sort, acceptance of its own contradiction, understanding that some questions don't have answers, and the only response to unanswerable questions is action. The warband grows larger under this new, more intense leadership. The Necron-raised orc leads them into increasingly dangerous fights, always seeking the greatest challenge, the fiercest opposition. Other orcs flock to this banner because the promise is simple. If you follow this weird, cold, strange orc, you will never lack for a good fight. That's all any orc truly wants. And in the grim darkness of the far future, perhaps that's the closest thing to meaning any of them can hope for. Conclusion: a testament to impossibility. The story of an orc raised by Necrons exists in the realm of thought experiment rather than established lore, but exploring it reveals profound truths about identity, nature, and nurture in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We've journeyed through an existence that should be impossible, following a being caught between two fundamentally opposed ways of being, shaped by circumstances that violate everything we understand about both species involved. What we've discovered is that biology and programming, nature and conditioning, are not simple opposites that can be easily resolved. The orc's genetic engineering creates imperatives as absolute as any Necron protocol, while the Necron conditioning attempts to impose order on chaos itself. The result is not a successful synthesis, but a perpetual tension, a being defined by contradiction rather than identity. The Necron-raised orc represents something unique in the galaxy, proof that even the most carefully designed biological weapons, even species engineered by gods, retain the capacity for adaptation beyond their intended parameters. The Old Ones created the orcs to fight Necrons in a specific way, but they could not account for every possible circumstance. The Necrons attempted to impose their order on pure chaos, and while they changed the orc, they could not fully control it. Both sides discovered the limits of their respective mastery over life and technology. But perhaps most importantly, this thought experiment reveals something about the nature of identity in Warhammer 40,000. In a universe where species are designed weapons, where entire civilizations exist to wage eternal war, where the line between organic and mechanical becomes increasingly blurred, what defines who or what you are? Is it your biology, your conditioning, your choices, your purpose? The Necron-raised orc forces us to confront these questions in their most extreme form. The tragedy of the Necron-raised orc is not that it exists in contradiction. The tragedy is that it's aware of the contradiction. A normal orc lives its entire life without questioning what it is. A Necron warrior, its consciousness reduced to near nothing by biotransference, lacks the capacity to contemplate its own existence. But the Necron-raised orc, cursed with just enough awareness to recognize its own impossibility, must live every moment knowing that it doesn't truly fit anywhere. And yet, it survives. That's perhaps the most fundamentally orc thing about it. Orcs survive. They adapt. They persist through circumstances that would destroy other species. The Necron-raised orc, in its strange, damaged way, is proof of this fundamental orcish resilience. It should have broken completely under the pressures it endured, that it didn't, that it found a way to keep existing even in impossible circumstances, speaks to the robustness of Old One's genetic engineering. As we conclude this exploration, remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no easy answers. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is built on contradictions, on impossible situations, on beings caught between conflicting imperatives. The Necron-raised orc is an extreme example, but in its way, it represents something universal. The struggle to find meaning and identity in circumstances not of your own making, to forge a path when no clear path exists, to simply keep existing when existence itself feels wrong. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest hypothetical scenarios in Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the dark corners of this grimdark universe, examining the lore from new angles, asking questions that don't have easy answers, and diving deep into what makes this setting so endlessly fascinating. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on what would happen to an orc raised by Necrons, or suggest other unusual scenarios you'd like us to explore. And remember, In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also questions worth asking, stories worth telling, and perspectives worth exploring. Thank you for watching.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.